human brain is a powerful time travel machine. It stores memories from our past, which it is constantly rearranging and reinterpreting to invent new futures. There's a scientific hypothesis behind this phenomenon of mental time travel called chronesthesia. Professor Endel Tolvin from University of Toronto tells us that our ancestors developed chronesthesia as a way of advancing their survival, because what it allowed them to do was kind of reflect on their past and use those memories to imagine how they needed to act or behave as they encountered similar situations. The way in which the two sides of our brain work has a deep effect in how we imagine our futures. Now, by show of hands, how many people here in the audience consider to be prominently left-brained? Very few, right? How many think that you're predominantly right-brained? Yeah, more of you. How many think that you are ambidextrous? You play on both sides? See, the way in which the two sides of the brain work together, like I said, has a deep impact on how we start imagining our futures. And we all like to think that we're the creative type, right? We're TEDx attending creative people. But I'm here to tell you that more often than not, it is our left brain that takes over the narratives of how we start thinking about our future. We all have heard the kind of the stereotypes and the words that we associate with the two sides of the brain. We say that the left brain is analytical, it's a rule follower, it's systematic, while the right brain is artistic, creative, and carefree. This kind of belief became very popular in the 1960s and 70s when the first split brain operations were performed. But as technologies for how we understand the way that the brain works became more sophisticated, neuroscientists started stepping away from this belief because they came to the realization that both sides of the brain are involved in all our mechanisms of thought. We used to think that language was only a left side of the brain activity, but they've come to realize that both sides of the brain are involved in the way that we process language. Both sides of the brain are involved in the way that we process visual imaging. Both sides of the brain, like I said, are involved in the way that we think about the future. But a more recent discovery that I borrowed from Dr. Ian McGilchrist is that the two sides of the brain have very different worldviews and propensities for how they process information. Okay? So in other words, when we are experiencing any situation, our brain is processing that separately, and we end up with two versions of the story: the left side version of the story and the right side version of the story. And like I said before, more often than not, it is the left brain that takes over the narrative. And I find that extremely problematic because we need the right brain in order to invent new futures that are not just a continuation of the past, that really take us into new directions. So what I want to talk with you about today is how exactly can we do that? What can we do to kind of get over that propensity of the left brain to take over? Because you see, over the past centuries, the left brain has not only taken over the way that we think and act as individuals, but also the way that we think and act as families, the organizations and institutions that we form, and the societies that bring us together. So think about any time that you've been in a bad situation, whether it's a job or a relationship that you're not really happy with. I'm going to use that as an example, because often when we're in those situations, what we do is we can imagine a future in which that situation is no longer present. Yet we find it really hard to act on that, right? And we finally take that step and say, well, how long have I been waiting? Why didn't I do that before? In the work that I do with organizations, I help leaders come up with new futures. The work that I do involves strategic innovation, which basically means helping these leaders imagine new futures for the organizations that they lead so that those organizations remain relevant in the future. And just like the example that I gave you, I find very often that these leaders can not only generate great ideas about where they can take their organizations, they can cohere around specific routes that they want to follow, and then they kind of talk themselves out of it once they need to start taking some action. They start finding comfort in the way that things are, regardless of whether the signs tell them that staying in that situation is the right thing to do. So I've been wondering for years why we have this tendency to just kind of find comfort in the familiar and trying to find solutions that can help not only my clients, but also help me in the way that I think about the future. And I like this idea of thinking about the right brain as the explorer that wants to sail away and find new lands and discover what's out there, what the left brain is saying, oh, you're crazy. You don't know what's out there. You don't know what perils, what risks. Why don't you just stay here? It's nice. Just stay here. And a couple of the things that I've come to realize, one of them is that, first of all, it's not very exciting to think of our future as just a continuation of our past, right? Looking at the rearview mirror and thinking, yeah, the road ahead pretty much looks like what we just did. So it's not exciting, but more than anything, we live in times where it is a huge risk to our survival to think that in the future we should be doing the same thing that we have been doing forever. Think about how many times you've seen in the news reports of people losing their jobs by the hundreds and then not being able to find employment because their skills are no longer relevant, right? Think about companies that once were iconic and they became too comfortable just providing the same products and services because life was good that way. And even if they came up with ideas that could take them into the future, in many instances they decide not to act on that idea just to see somebody else pick up that idea and take them out of business. But I also like to think that, that we're more interested in having this kind of rainbow of options of where we can take our life in the future. By the same token of the example that I gave you before, we also live in a time where bringing change to our lives is not only kind of socially admitted, it's almost table stakes, right? We live in times where the jobs that people will be doing in 10, 15, or 20 years don't exist today. We're not teaching them. We live in times where people don't just change jobs, they change careers several times in their lives. So it is now more common than ever to find that changing our lives is something that is socially accepted. So the question I want to explore with you today is exactly how can we do that? How can we train our brain to help us invent this rainbow and variety of new futures, not just that line that continues being a repetition of the past. Now, in the work that I've done with the leaders in organizations I mentioned before, I found that there are certain things that the right brain absolutely loves that we can use to do this, to give the right brain a fair chance of dominating the narrative, if not at the same level as the left brain, to actually advance it. And there are a few things that the right brain really loves. One of them is big picture. The right brain doesn't like to be lost in details. It likes to keep kind of a gestalt, a whole view of whatever territory it's dealing with. Another thing that the right brain really loves is this idea of visualization and visual thinking. It likes to think with images more than words. The right brain loves nuanced thinking. So using communication and language as an example, which I mentioned before, when we're having a conversation with a person, while the left brain is thinking about the literal meaning of the words that are coming out of that person's mouth, the right brain is paying attention to things that are more nuanced, like the person's body posture and the tone of their voice. Because the right brain loves nuanced thinking, it also loves poetry and metaphor. It's where it finds a lot of that nuance. Think about any poem that you have read that has transported you to a new place that you haven't seen before, and you can actually feel it inside of you. And finally, the right brain is created with being one of the centers of empathy in our brain. The right brain, scientists tell us, is the place where we actually became aware of ourselves, our sense of self, and our sense of self in the context of others. So what I'll do is give you a few examples of things that I've done and things that I've seen that have brought some of these things to practice in hopes that you can apply them to your own life, and if you have a big dream that you want to bring to life, that you actually use some of these things to do that. The first thing that I'll talk about is how we can use visual images to start thinking about the future. A few years ago, I was doing some work for a financial services company, and they noticed that there was a segment in the market of people who had enough money in assets that they needed to have financial advice, but they decided not to. And they wanted us to understand why. What were the motivations behind these people choosing not to engage with a financial advisor? So I went to visit people at their homes, people who fit into this segment. And the first couple that I visited was a young couple in their 30s. So I get there, we start talking very casually about things in general. And at some point in the conversation, I pull out a template that I had put together. It was a tabloid-sized piece of paper that, other than just 3 lines, exemplifying 3 columns, it didn't have much in it, right? The 3 columns were meant to represent their financial goals 1, 3, and 5 years out. So I put that piece of paper in front of them and I say, I would like for you to start writing your financial goals under each one of these columns for me. And they kind of just looked at each other, and they looked at me, and they couldn't come up with anything. I was thinking to myself, gee, these people don't have any goals, with financial goals. But I remembered that I had this pack of image cards in my bag that I had used at another session a couple of days before. And I just pulled it out, and I said to them, maybe this will help you pick your brain. And like before I was even done talking, they started putting these cards on the piece of paper and talking about the things that they wanted to do with their money, and I just couldn't get them to stop talking. At some point, the wife puts a picture of a baby on the 3-year column, and the husband looks at her going, really? She goes, well, yeah, I would like to have a baby at some point. And I realized through this exercise that I was exciting a part of the brain with those cards that had remained dormant while I was asking them to use words and their language to explain to me how they saw their finances in the future. Another way that we can think about shaping our futures is metaphors. Metaphors are so pervasive in the way that we communicate every day that we don't even pay attention to them. This example is from a 2011 study conducted by 2 members of the psychology department at Stanford University called Metaphors We Think With, the role of metaphor in reasoning. What they did is they recruited 1,000 people to do an online study. And everyone in that group received a body of text that was 1 paragraph with 80 words in it. But half of the people had a different word in the first sentence from the other half. So 1 half received a piece of text that said, crime is a beast that is ravaging the city of Addison. So think for yourself, just for a second, what images come to mind when you're thinking about the word beast? While the other group received a piece of text that had the opening of crime is a virus ravaging the city of Addison. So like I said, they read through this 80-word paragraph. Then they asked them to propose solutions for the problem of violence. What they found is that the vast majority of the people in the first group came up with ideas of things that you would do to attack a beast, right? Things like stronger law enforcement. While the second group overwhelmingly came up with more ideas that were about things that you would do to heal a virus, like, in this case, stronger education and policies for economic development of some of these people. So just 1 word in an 80-word piece of text totally changed the framing of how people approach the rest of the text. We do this every day in the way that we approach situations, right? We say, for example, I'm going to approach a new situation, and I can see it as a dark forest that I'm walking through, and it's scary, and it's nighttime, and anything could come and attack me. Or we can think of these new situations as an adventure that we are prepared for, and we're carrying a backpack, and we know that we want to summit this mountain that is in front of us. So think about the metaphors that you use every day to approach new situations. And the next example that I wanted to share with you is this idea of empathy and how do we see ourselves in the context of us with others. I think one of the most beautiful ways in which we can relate to other people is sharing a meal with them. The women in this picture are members of a movement called Detroit Soup. The way that Detroit Soup works is basically people come together once a month in a very distressed part of Detroit to share a meal and exchange ideas. So if you go to Detroit Soup, you pay $5 at the entrance, and that $5 pays for soup, bread, salad, and 1 vote. Anyone who has an idea can pitch their idea. They get 4 minutes, no matter in what state the idea is. And at the end of the evening, every person gets 1 vote for their favorite idea. The person who gets the most votes walks away with all the money that was collected at the entrance. Now, the person with the black T-shirt that says Detroit Soup and the glasses, her name is Amy. I met her a couple of times this year, once in Detroit, once in Chicago. And she said something that so beautifully kind of illustrates this point that I'm making. She says that for the people who come to share their ideas, it is not about the money. At the end of the day, they're walking out with maybe a few $100s. But it's the fact that they have this group of people that is willing to listen to them. And by putting that idea in front of them, they get encouragement, they get feedback, they get the offer for support to keep advancing that idea. I think there's something really beautiful about just sitting down with a group of strangers and kind of breaking bread together and sharing ideas that is at the heart of what Detroit Soup is all about. One of the early recipients of this monthly award from Detroit Soup was Veronica Scott. Veronica came to Detroit Soup with an idea that was a coat for homeless people that could double as a sleeping bag at night. And she obviously got overwhelming support. And she started talking about anyone who would listen to her about her idea. From the CEO of Carhartt, a company that makes jackets and clothing, all the way down to homeless people who would be the users of her product. In one of those conversations with a group of homeless women, somebody interrupted her and said, "Lady, I don't need a jacket. What I need is a job." And just that one sentence helped her rethink the way that she was approaching this whole thing, right? She was seeing it as a solution for homeless people while they stayed in their homelessness. And what this one comment made her think is that there was an idea of empowerment behind what she was doing. And now that her company has grown, it's called Empowerment Plan, she today employs over 20 women who were at some point homeless in the city of Detroit. So you see, we have this beautiful power in our right brain to think about the different futures in which we can take our life that are much more different than just the things that we have done in the past. I hope that with the things that I have shared with you, you'll have some inspiration to start using these tools that really trigger the right brain to start thinking about how you can take your life in the future. I want to leave you tonight with this question: how will you use your right brain to travel into the future? Thank you.